So good afternoon. I'm William Kirby, Director of the Fairbank Center, and it's an enormous pleasure to welcome you to the annual Reischauer Lectures. These lectures are named for Edwin O. Reischauer, University professor at Harvard, who is John Fairbank's close collaborator in inaugurating the teaching of modern East Asia at Harvard. Fairbank and Reischauer began the course Tradition and Transformation in East Asia in 1939, the famous rice paddies course, still taught today at Harvard in several different incarnations. And it takes at least 4 Harvard professors today to do what 2 of them did in 1939. Reischauer himself was a man of enormous breadth of learning, educated as a young man in the American School of Tokyo, then at Oberlin, then is now among the most international of America's liberal arts colleges, before coming to Harvard to study with Serge Eliseev. He would go on to distinguish himself both in sinology and in Japanese and in East Asian history, in broader government service, both in World War II, and then as the United States ambassador to Japan. These lectures have always assumed, as Reischauer did, that there is something called civilization in and beyond East Asia that needs explication, civilization that goes across national borders. And to that end, we have each year invited a scholar of unusual breadth of interests and expertise to give them. We are delighted to have with us today, and for the next 2 days, for this purpose, Professor Donald Lopez. And to introduce Professor Lopez, let me now turn to my colleague, Professor Janet Gayatsu. Janet?
It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome Donald Lopez, who is the A.E. Link Distinguished University Professor of Buddhist Studies at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Prior to holding that position, he was the member and chair for many years of the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at University of Michigan. Donald Lopez is a leading figure in that corner of the field of Buddhist studies that is engaged in the assessment of Orientalist scholarship on Buddhism and the formation of the category of modern Buddhism. He's a very prolific writer, numerous monographs and edited works, including a multi-volume set on Asian religions for Princeton's Readings in Religion series. But he's best known for his work in post-Orientalist scholarship, which has been very influential and at times quite controversial in the larger field of Buddhist studies. Donald Lopez nonetheless had a very traditional start with a PhD from the University of Virginia in 1982 in the religion department there under the tutelage of Professor Jeffrey Hopkins. Indeed, his first book was a straight-ahead description of the Buddhist Swatantraga philosophical school in India and Tibet, a work that those who are familiar only with his critical work might find in some degree surprising, but at the time it earned him his chops in Buddhist philology and philosophy, and I might add made a very useful contribution in its own right. And indeed, in preparing for the introduction today, I looked at my own copy, which is right here. Some of you may not know this work. In which I found my own very copious and painstaking notes in this very book, which I myself read extremely carefully soon after it came out in 1987 in my own early teaching career in Buddhist studies. Donald Lopez continued in this, what we might call representational mode, with his next book, The Heart Sutra Explained, Indian and Tibetan Commentaries, that came out in 1988, just a year later. But by the time that he published a follow-up to this study of the Heart Sutra, a much more historical and hermeneutical essay on the same topic, but from a very different approach, in 1996, you could detect a major shift in his entire orientation to Buddhist studies work. This is the book called Elaboration on Emptiness, Uses of the Heart Sutra, from 1996. And this shift, I think, was especially evident in a edited volume that Lopez also produced during this period, entitled Buddhist Hermeneutics. Came out in 1998, and as I say, this was an edited volume, notable not just for the array of creative approaches to the topic that he himself marshaled out of the field, but perhaps even more fundamentally for the very idea that the term hermeneutics can indeed be used to describe what Buddhists have been doing since the early centuries CE. I'd say Lopez's major sort of shift in identity, and it's probably can be best located with another edited volume, Curators of the Buddha, a very widely received and well-received work, a stunning critical assessment of the field of Buddhist studies itself that came out in 1995, followed by Prisoners of Shangri-La, Tibetan Buddhism and the West from 1998. This book was seen by many, accurately or not, as bursting the bubble of the romantic discourse around Tibet, to the point that an entire panel at the American Academy of Religion was held to assess the book, a panel of which I myself was the hapless chair, regarding which I remember well how I decided that I needed to position my own chair strategically on the platform between Donald Lopez and Robert Thurman, Robert Thurman being the butt of some of Lopez's most critical salvos in the book, out of my own fears, I think not entirely unfounded, that my panelists might actually come to blows. And I remember also noticing that the wheels on my chair were very well oiled, so in case I had to make a quick escape. Donald Lopez has continued in this critical assessment of modern Buddhist studies. Another more recent but very major contribution has been his study of Buddhism and Science, subtitle A Guide for the Perplexed, just came out in 2008. And again, another, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a biography. That's Princeton University Press, 2011. One more trajectory, a related trajectory, but slightly different in his recent work, I think is well exemplified in two other books on the embattled Tibetan monk of the early 20th century, Gyindon Chumpel. One of those is entitled In the Forest of Faded Wisdom, 104 Poems by Gyindon Chumpel, which Don carefully translated, came out in 2009, and also his 2005 study entitled The Madman's Middle Way, which was a study of Gyindon Chumpel's own extremely controversial study of Madhyamaka philosophy. I'd say that we glimpse in these two works in particular another thread of Don Lopez's intellectual trajectory in which his distinction between his own subject position and that of the Tibetan Buddhists he studies is becoming increasingly undecidable. We can also find a related, what I'd say is a kind of destabilization of his subject position in some of Don Lopez's recent work on the very Orientalists of whom he has been so critical. Perhaps already evident, at least to me, some years ago in a conversation I once had with Don on Lieutenant Colonel L.A. Waddell, who was a British Army surgeon in Tibet in the late 19th century, author of the book Lhasa and Its Mysteries, and any number of other, indeed, extremely Orientalist works on Tibet, one major part of which was Waddell's scathing reduction of all of Tibetan Buddhism to a kind of pagan demon worship cult. And I remember Don confiding to me at one point in this conversation that maybe Waddell was actually right about that. From what I gather from his website, actually, I'll just tell you that Professor Lopez refused to give me the most recent copy of his CV in preparation for this introduction, so I had to put together its history myself. But what we gather from his website, all three of his talks now in the Reischauer series represent pieces of some of his current scholarly work, and perhaps we're going to see further twists in the entire question of criticism and subject position. Tonight's lecture, the first in the series, is entitled A Christian Buddha, The Medieval Tale of Barlam and Josaphat. Let me just add at this point that after Professor Lopez's lecture, we are going to have a response. This is from Charles Hallisey, Yehan Numata Senior Lecturer in Buddhist Literatures at Harvard Divinity School. Professor Hallisey's field of study is Theravada Buddhism, with specialty in Sri Lanka, and much of his current work is situated in the areas of Buddhism and literature and in Buddhist ethics. So let us welcome first Professor Don Lopez.
Thank you, Janet. And I'll remember to report a private conversation next time I introduce you. I'm delighted and honored to be invited to deliver the Reischauer lectures this year. Any event of this kind requires a great deal of labor on the part of the host. I would like to begin by thanking William Kirby and the staff at the Fairbank Center, especially Associate Director Lydia Chen, for their efforts over the past few months. I'd also like to acknowledge Mark Elliott of the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations, who in a moment of delirium seems to have suggested my name for the lectures. After nominating me, he immediately departed for the continent of Australia. In addition, let me thank in advance the three respondents, Charles Hallisey, James Robson, and Leonard Vanderkype, for their comments they will provide, although their request that I send the lectures in advance meant that I couldn't write the 3 lectures on the plane today. I'm particularly honored to be the first scholar of Buddhism to deliver the Reischauer lectures, and it is appropriate that a scholar of Buddhism should do so, since one of Professor Reischauer's first books in 1955 was a still important translation of the travel diary of the 9th century Tendai monk, Edwin. Let me begin with a preview of the lectures I will give today, tomorrow, and Thursday. A French colleague and I recently published a translation of a work entitled Introduction to the History of Indian Buddhism. This is the rather prosaic name of the first European monograph on Buddhism published in 1844. It was written by Eugène Burnouf, holder of the then newly established chair in Sanskrit at the Collège de France. Although this massive tome is largely forgotten, or at least unread today, its oblivion derives not so much from its obsolescence as from its influence. The portrait that it paints of Buddhism, and especially of the Buddha, has become so familiar that we tend to forget its rather recent provenance. Indeed, while working on this project, I came to the conclusion that our view of the Buddha today derives largely from Burnouf, and that view has changed very little over the past century and a half. This Buddha is certainly the most pleasant of the founders of the world religions. He never turned rivers of water into rivers of blood or caused a hail of toads. He never ordered the execution of his enemies. He never even overturned the tables of moneylenders. He just sat under trees and talked to those who happened to be passing by. He is not depicted carrying stone tablets or wielding a sword or nailed to a cross. He just sits on the ground with his legs crossed, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes cast down. Everybody likes the Buddha, and they should. But all this is rather new. The European encounter with Buddhism extends long before the 19th century and Burnouf. The first reference is said to be from the 3rd century CE, when in describing the Indian gymnosophists, the naked philosophers, Clement of Alexandria writes, quote, "Some of the Indians obey the precepts of Bauta, whom on account of his extraordinary sanctity they have raised to divine honors." After completing the Burnouf translation, I decided that it would be more interesting to examine European views of the Buddha before Burnouf than those after Burnouf. And what I found was that during most of the history of their encounters with the Buddha, Europeans, whether they were diplomats, merchants, physicians, or missionaries, did not particularly like the Buddha. They regarded him as an idol, in fact, a particularly pernicious idol of the pagan world. It's important to recall that into the 19th century, European writers divided the peoples of the world into 4 nations in the old sense of that term: Christians, Jews, Mohammedans, and idolaters. What we think of today as Buddhism, Buddhists, were described by this last term, idolaters, a word that we regard today, still feeling the power of St. Thomas Aquinas, as a term of abuse. And in some sense, what we think of today as the academic study of religion has over the past 2 centuries been devoted to the process of separating out various groups of these idolaters and giving them their own religions, each ending in ism: Hinduism, Taoism, Confucianism, Shintoism, Buddhism, and according to some, yet another idolatrous sect, Roman Catholicism. Thus, over many years, over many centuries, European travelers to Asia and their readers never identified the religion they encountered with the name Buddhism, a term that, according to the OED, first appears in English only in 1801. They did not describe its priests as Buddhists. Instead, they referred to the monks they encountered simply as idolaters and the statues that they worshipped as idols, and as idols known by many names. In my reading of sources from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, I've encountered over 250 different names for this idol, names like Zaka, Chekia, Somotokodom, Budu, Poti, Gudam, Debat, and Photo. My lectures this week will be about this idol, an idol that is long forgotten. I mentioned the oblivion suffered by Burnouf. This idol has suffered his own oblivion, but they are different forms of forgetting. Burnouf has been forgotten because we tend to feel that he was right. The idol has been forgotten because we tend to feel that what Europeans said about him, from his name to his life to the very fact that he was an idol, is quite wrong. If there is a structure of scientific revolutions, and if philology is a science, then a shift took place in the wake of Burnouf and his contemporaries, a shift that was so profound that the previous discourse about the Buddha could be displaced, discarded, and forgotten because it was simply wrong. But sometimes it is a task of the scholar to dig through the refuse. In this case, the pile is huge, and what I have to say will necessarily be quite limited. In my lectures, I will approach this very large topic of the Buddha as idol from three different perspectives. Following a rough chronological order, the first and third lectures will provide case studies, the first of a text, the third of a person. The second lecture tomorrow will provide something of an overview of the range of European responses to the Buddha. Thus, today's lecture will deal with the medieval tale of Barlam and Josaphat. Tomorrow's lecture will examine three different interpretations of the Buddha as idol, from Roman Catholic missionaries to China, Thailand, and Vietnam in the 16th and 17th centuries. The final lecture will examine the views of the Buddha of Ippolito Desideri, the Jesuit missionary to Tibet who arrived in Lhasa in 1716. I hope to show that he understood Buddhism better, or at least from our perspective more accurately, than any European prior to Burnouf, and yet he thought that the Buddha was an idol and that the Tibetans were idolaters. The three lectures, however, will have a single epigraph. It comes from Marco Polo himself, who, seated in the pleasure dome in Xanadu, described invisible cities to Kublai Khan. After his years of service to the great Khan, he sailed home to Venice, his ship making port in Sri Lanka, probably in 1292. In his account of the island, he describes the mountain that is known as Adam's Peak, and I quote, "Furthermore, you must know that in the island of Ceylon, there is an exceedingly high mountain. It rises up so steep and precipitous that no one could ascend it, were it not that they have taken and fixed to it several great massive iron chains, so disposed that by the help of these, men are able to mount to the top. And I tell you, they say that on this mountain is the sepulchre of Adam, our first parent. At least that is what the Saracens say. But the idolaters say it is the sepulchre of Sagamoni Borkan, before whose time there were no idols. They hold him to have been the best of men, a great saint, in fact, according to their fashion, and the first in whose name idols were made." After appearing first in Greek among the works of the 8th century monk St. John of Damascus, during the Middle Ages, the story of Barlam and Josaphat would be translated into Armenian, Hebrew, Latin, French, Italian, German, Dutch, English, Spanish, Polish, Icelandic, Yiddish, and later, in 1712, into Tagalog, language of the Philippines. It is especially famous for the parables that the monk Barlam uses to instruct Prince Josaphat in the Christian faith. These parables would be appropriated by some of the greatest writers of the Renaissance. For example, the story of the three caskets, well known from the Merchant of Venice, and later the subject of an essay by Freud, comes originally from Barlam and Josaphat. Shakespeare found it in the Golden Legend. In 1611, Lope de Vega published a play based on the tale entitled Barlam and Josaphat. The story also inspired devotion to its two protagonists. In 1571, the Doge of Venice presented a bone from Josaphat's spine to King Sebastian of Portugal. The bone is enshrined today in the Church of St. Salvatore in Antwerp. In 1583, Pope Sixtus V authorized November 27 as Barlam and Josaphat Saints' Day. Josaphat was assigned August 26th in the Eastern Orthodox Church and May 19th in the Georgian Orthodox Church. And the chapel of Devo Josaphat was built in Palermo in the 16th century. Barlam and Josaphat were revered for converting India to Christianity, or for doing so the second time. The first conversion is said to have been accomplished by the Apostle Thomas. Let me begin by offering a very brief plot summary of Barlam and Josaphat. India is ruled by a king named Avenir, a worshiper of idols and a persecutor of Christians. When a son is born to the king, he assembles the astrologers to predict his future. All but one predict his glory. The one dissenter says that the son's glory will not be of this world. Alarmed, the king builds a city to prevent the child, whom he names Josaphat, from learning of the sorrows of the world. However, the prince eventually receives his father's permission to make excursions outside the city. On the first, he encounters a blind man and a crippled man. On the second, he meets an old man. Here is the passage from the John of Damascus version. Not many days after, as he was again taking his walks abroad, he happened upon an old man, well stricken in years, shriveled in countenance, feeble-kneed, bent doubled, gray-haired, toothless, and with broken utterance. The prince was seized with astonishment, and calling the old man near, desired to know the meaning of this strange sight. His companions answered, "This man is now well advanced in years, and his gradual decrease of strength, with the increase of weakness, hath brought him to the misery that thou seest." And, said he, "What will be his end?" They answered, "Naught but death will relieve him." "But," said he, "is this the appointed doom of all mankind, or doth it happen only to some?" They answered, "Unless death come beforehand to remove him, no dweller on earth, but as life advanceth, must make trial of this lot." Then the young prince asked in how many years this overtook a man, and whether the doom of death was without reprieve, and whether there was no way to escape it and avoid coming to such misery. They answered him, "In 80 or 100 years men arrive at this old age, and then they die, since there is none other way, for death is a debt due to nature, laid on men from the beginning, and its approach is inexorable." Although persecuted by King Avenir in India, Christianity is apparently thriving in Sri Lanka, and the Christian ascetic Barlam soon arrives from Serendip and secretly converts Josaphat to Christianity. When his father learns of the conversion, he tries to dissuade him from following Barlam into the ascetic life by sending beautiful women to seduce the virgin prince. When this fails, the king offers his son half of his kingdom, which he accepts, and quickly converts to Christianity. Josaphat eventually converts his father to the true faith, and after the king's death, Josaphat rules over the Christian kingdom of India, now united. At the end of the story, Josaphat renounces the throne and goes off in search of his teacher Barlam. After 2 years, he finally finds his teacher, at the point of death. Josaphat himself dies soon thereafter, and their bodies, laid side by side, are returned to Josaphat's capital, where they are enshrined and worshipped as miracles abound. This is the barest outline of the story. Its popularity in the Middle Ages derived in large part from the many sermons and parables that filled the story, especially those sermons by which Barlam converts the prince. The most important of these interpolations is the Apology of Aristides, a polemic against the religions of the Greeks, Chaldeans, and Egyptians. This 2nd century work, mentioned by St. Jerome himself, was thought to have been lost in Greek until it was discovered as one of the soliloquies in Barlam and Josaphat. For the student of Buddhism, and by this I mean the undergraduate student of Buddhism, the parallels between Barlam and Josaphat and the life of the Buddha are patently clear. And yet those parallels were only discerned by European scholars rather recently. It's almost as if the identity of the Buddha and Prince Josaphat could not be recognized in Europe until the Buddha himself had been elevated, at least in the eyes of some, to the status of a saint. The first scholar to recognize those elements appears to have been the great Jewish Sanskrit scholar Theodor Benfi, who noted them in the introduction to his 2-volume translation of the Panchatantra, a collection of Indian fables published in Leipzig in 1853. The French savant Edouard Laboulaye, best remembered for his books on American politics and law, was the first to draw a direct parallel between the life of Josaphat and the life of the Buddha. He did so in an article in a French weekly in 1859. The following year, the German folklorist and translator of Barlam and Josaphat, Felix Liebrecht, published an article linking the story to a specific Buddhist text, the famously Baroque Life of the Buddha de Lalita Vistara, a work of which Borges writes, quote, "In its pages, the history of the Redeemer is inflated to the point of oppression and vertigo." Liebrecht was in fact mistaken in his association, likely made because the Lalita Vistara was the first biography of the Buddha to have been translated into European language. The French scholar of Sanskrit and Tibetan, Philippe Edouard Foucault, student of the great Burnouf, had translated the text from Tibetan in 1847. Since Liebrecht, there has been significant progress on the origins of Barlam and Josaphat, although not all the way back to a specific Buddhist source. The Greek text found in the works of John of Damascus is no longer attributed to him, but instead to the 10th century Georgian monk, St. Euthemius of Mount Athos, who translated the tale from his native Georgian into Greek. From Georgian, it's been traced back to Arabic. Scholars speculate that the Arabic story was turned into a Christian tale by Georgian Christians in Jerusalem sometime between 800 and 900 CE, calling it the life of the blessed Iodasaph. From Arabic sources, we learn that in Baghdad in the 2nd century of the Hijra, that is the late 8th or early 9th century, a book was translated into Arabic from Middle Persian that bore the title Kitab Balahar wa Budasaf, the book of Balahar and Budasaf. This story, which only survives in an incomplete version, makes no mention of Christianity or Buddhism, but instead tells the story of an idolatrous king who wishes to save his son from the dangers of asceticism. After that, the trail goes cold, although some scholars have speculated that the Persian text is derived from a Manichaean version of the life of the Buddha. We can say that the name Josaphat comes from Iodasaph, which comes from Budasaph, which comes from Bodhisattva. So we're dealing with the story of Barlam and Bodhisattva. As we know in Buddhist sources, Prince Siddhartha is often referred to simply as the Bodhisattva. And so the story of the Buddha, although not identified as such, was known to the Christian world in Greek in the 10th century and then in Latin in 1048. For the life of the Buddha, rather than the life of Josaphat, we return to Marco Polo, where we find from the 13th century one of the most accurate and perhaps the most sympathetic account of the life of the Buddha, or Sagamuni Borkan, as he calls him using the Mongol name, to appear in Europe prior to the 19th century. The following translation is from one of the most remarkable scholars of the Victorian age, the Scottish Orientalist and veteran of the Sikh Wars, Henry Yule, and I quote, "He was the son, as their story goes, of a great and wealthy king, and as he was of such a holy temper that he would never listen to any worldly talk, nor would he consent to be king. And when the father saw that his son would not be king, nor yet take any part in affairs, he took it sorely to heart. And first he tried to tempt him with great promises, offering to crown him king and to surrender all authority into his hands. The son, however, would have none of his offers, so the father was in great trouble, and all the more that he had no other son but him, to whom he might bequeath the kingdom at his own death. So, after taking thought on the matter, the king caused a great palace to be built, and placed his son therein, and caused him to be waited on there by a number of maidens, the most beautiful that could anywhere be found, and he ordered them to divert themselves with the prince night and day, to sing and dance before him, so as to draw his heart towards worldly enjoyments. But 'twas all of no avail, for none of those maidens could ever tempt the king's son to any wantonness, and he only abode the firmer in his chastity, leading a most holy life after their manner of thereof. And I assure that he was so staid a youth that he had never gone out of the palace, and thus he'd never seen a dead man, nor anyone who was not hale and sound, for the father never allowed any man who was aged or infirm to come into his presence. It came to pass, however, that one day that the young gentleman took a ride, and by the roadside he beheld a dead man. The sight dismayed him greatly, as he had never seen such a sight before. Incontinently he demanded of those who were with him what thing was this was. And then they told him it was a dead man. How then, quoth the king's son, do all men die? Yea, forsooth, said they. Whereupon the young gentleman never said a word, but rode on right pensively. And after he had ridden a good way, he fell in with a very aged man who could no longer walk, and had not a tooth in his head, having lost all because of his great age. And when the king's son beheld this old man, he asked what that might mean, and wherefore the man could not walk. Those who were with him replied that it was through old age the man could no longer walk, and had lost all his teeth. And so when the king's son had thus learned about the dead man and about the aged man, he turned back to the palace and said to himself that he would abide no longer in this evil world, but would go in search of him who dieth not and who created him. So what did he one night but take his departure from the palace privily, and betake himself to certain lofty and pathless mountains, and there he did abide, leading a life of great hardship and sanctity, and keeping great abstinence, just as if he'd been a Christian. Indeed, had he but been so, he would have been a great saint of our Lord Jesus Christ, so good and pure was the life he led. And when he died, they found his body and brought it to his father. And when the father saw dead before him that son whom he loved better than himself, he was nearly going distraught with sorrow, and he caused an image in the similitude of his son to be wrought in gold and precious stones, and caused the people to adore it, and they all declared him to be a god, and so they still say. Marco Polo's account was widely read in Europe, and at least one of his readers saw the connection between the life of the Buddha and the story of Barlam and Josaphat. In 1446, a full 4 centuries before the connection would be noticed again in Europe, an unnamed editor of Marco Polo's biography added the following comment to Polo's description of the Buddha's encounters with death and old age, quote, "This is like the life of Saint Josaphat, who was the son of King Avenir of those parts of India, and was converted to the Christian faith by means of Barlam, according as is read in the life and legends of the Holy Fathers." Thus, Marco Polo's readers did not conclude that the lives of Saints Barlam and Josaphat originated from the story of this idol, but rather the story of this idol came from Barlam and Josaphat. In a work published in 1612, the Portuguese traveler and historian Diogo de Couto, also who traveled in both India and Ceylon, described the Buddha, whom he calls Budao. To this name, the Gentiles, by which he means heathens, throughout all India have dedicated great and superb pagodas. With reference to this story, we have been delayed in inquiring if the ancient Gentiles of those parts had in their writings any knowledge of Josaphat, who was converted by Barlam, who in his legend is represented as the son of a great king in India, who had just the same upbringing, with all the same particulars that we have recounted of the life of Budao. And as it informs us that he was the son of a great king in India, it may well be, as we have said, that he was the Budao of whom they relate such marvels. And so Josaphat is not the Buddha is Josaphat. The Buddhists are worshiping the wrong deity. It's a case of mistaken identity. There will be more such cases in my lecture tomorrow. But under the circumstances, it is easy to understand the mistake. The parallels between the two stories are numerous. In each, an Indian king wishes to prevent his beloved son from entering the religious life, and so builds a palace to protect him from the sorrows of the world. In each, the son eventually ventures beyond the palace walls to encounter an old man, a sick man, and a monk. The monk inspires the son to leave behind the life of a prince and go out in search of the truth. Each prince eventually finds the truth and returns home to convert his father to it. And yet the truth that they find and the fathers they convert are very different. King Avenir, the father of Prince Josaphat, is a tyrant, an idolater, and a persecutor of Christians. His son converts him to Christianity after becoming the disciple of Barlam, a monk who's come to India from the island of Serendip. The father of Prince Siddhartha, the future Buddha, is a righteous and pious king who wishes only that his son succeed him on the throne, yet his son sets out in search of nirvana, 6 years later becoming the master of that more transcendent realm. There are other significant differences. For example, in the Buddhist story, the prince not only encounters an old man and a sick man, but also a corpse, his first encounter with the fact of death. A further parallel scene occurs in the harem after each father, in a final attempt to keep his son from renouncing the world, instructs the women of the harem to seduce him. Neither prince succumbs, but each resists in a different way. The future Buddha's attitude toward the women is largely one of detached pity. Part of his equanimity in the face of such seductive beauty obviously derives from his exalted spiritual rank. The noble resolve of the prince is far greater than the women's charms, and eventually the gods cause them to collapse on the floor and fall asleep in all manner of unsightly poses, while the prince remains seated on his golden throne. This scene is portrayed formulaically elsewhere in Buddhist literature, but in the Buddhacharita, Ashvaghosha pauses over each of the sleeping women, describing their poses in erotic detail. Unlike other authors, the scene does not evoke the charnel ground, yet the prince surveys them with disgust. In addition to his advanced spiritual state, Prince Siddhartha's ease in resisting the women derives from another important difference from his Christian counterpart. Prince Siddhartha is not a virgin. He has been sequestered in the palace for 29 years, where he was schooled in all the arts, including the arts of love. There's a standard list of 12 deeds that all Buddhists perform. Included in the list is enjoying the company of consorts. The prince had already married the beautiful Yashodhara, and he has or will have a son. According to most accounts, his son Rahula is born on the day that he renounces the world, but in another, and for our purposes more interesting version, a version found in both the Mahavasthu and the Mulasarvastavad Vinaya, the prince's last act before leaving the palace that night is to make love to his wife. Rahula is not born that night, but instead is conceived that night. And earning eternal sympathy for his mother, he is not born until the night of his father's enlightenment, 6 years hence. Although the symbolism of the sex act can be variously interpreted, it provides a different perspective on the harem scene and an important contrast with the story of Josaphat. For Prince Josaphat burns with the flames of lust, almost succumbing to the charms of a slave princess who promises to convert to Christianity if he will just spend one night in her arms. When that fails, she provides all manner of convincing arguments, including learned citations from the Bible, for the legitimacy of Christian marriage. But he somehow falls asleep while struggling with his passion, and in his dreams he sees visions of heaven and hell, the heaven that awaits the chaste, the hell where the lustful are tormented for eternity. In contrast, Prince Siddhartha makes love to his wife and then renounces the world. In the story of Barlam and Josaphat, the prince falls asleep before he can make love. In the story of the Buddha, at least in this one version, the prince falls asleep after he's made love. He awakens to find the women of the harem asleep around him. To him, they look like they are dead. And from a certain perspective, women remain dead to the Buddha for the rest of his life. These and other variations provide an occasion to reflect on some of the fundamental differences between Christianity and Buddhism, at least as represented in these classic texts, on such central topics as the meaning of death, meaning of desire, the nature of the religious quest, and the role of gender in each religion. Barlam and Josaphat is a story in which the life of the Buddha long lay hidden. It was a story that was used by Christian missionaries to convert the heathens of Asia to the gospel, just as Prince Josaphat had converted his own father. His father was an idolater, and for much of Europe's long encounter with Buddhism, the Buddha was an idol, known by many names, and the Buddhists who worshipped him were idolaters. Thus, this story, used by Christians to convert idolaters, a story whose hero, Josaphat, was a smasher of idols, was derived from a tradition whose hero, the Buddha, was an idol in the eyes of Christians. Fascinating ironies continue to multiply, for the story is found among the works of St. John of Damascus, who served at the court of a Muslim caliph who opposed idolatry, where during the iconoclasm debates, John wrote his famous work defending the worship of images of Jesus and the Virgin Mary, treatise against those decrying the holy images. There were idols and there were icons, and the Catholic saint found a way to condemn one and defend the other. In 1685, the Portuguese captain João Ribeiro presented an account of his history of Ceylon to the King of Portugal. Describing the gods of Ceylon, he writes, quote, "One takes preeminence of all these who is called Budu, and for whom they profess the greatest reverence. He's represented in the form of a man of gigantic size, being about 32 feet tall. They have a tradition that this Budu lived for a long time in Ceylon and led there a most penitent and holy life. They reckon their years from his residence among them, and by this calculation it appears that he lived about the 40th year of the Christian era. And it is probable he was St. Thomas the Apostle, for it is a general tradition in the East that he preached the gospel to all these nations. The Sinhalese say that he was not born among them, and that he left their country and died on the continent of India. This is perfectly in accord with the common opinion received among the Christians of India, and especially those who live on the Coromandel coast, who are called St. Thomas's Christians." We must recall that when the Europeans first arrived in India at the end of the 15th century, Buddhism had been dead there for some centuries. They did not encounter Buddhists in India, but they encountered Buddhists in Sri Lanka, where they learned, as Marco Polo had, that the Buddha, by whatever name he was known, had visited the island. Although the Europeans did not find Buddhists in India, they found a Christian community there, believed to be descendants of those who had been converted from idolatry by St. Thomas the Apostle. From one perspective, then, this view of the Buddha as St. Thomas fits nicely with the Barlam story, since Barlam comes to India from the island of Serendip, a monk of the community that St. Thomas had founded centuries before. But if the Buddha is the purveyor of idolatry, as he was widely seen by the Portuguese missionaries and soldiers in Ceylon, and Barlam is his disciple, then pagan idolatry is what is being taught to the son of King Avenir, himself a pagan idolater. It all seems very confusing. Among all the Buddhist and Christian complications, some clarity might be found in Islam. Perhaps the Muslim version has something to teach us about the story of Barlam and Joseph, about the story of Buddhism and Christianity. The Muslim version is not so much about doctrine as it is about practice, about the relative value of the life of the king in the world versus the life of the anchorite in his cave. We recall that biographies of the Buddha did not begin to appear until some 4 centuries after his death, and that the earliest versions were more concerned with the lives of previous Buddhas than with the life of Shakyamuni. The familiar story, the 4 excursions from the palace, during which the king sees in turn an old man, a sick man, a dead man, and a mendicant, do not appear until later. The work regarded by scholars as perhaps the oldest biography, the Mahavastu, has elements that may date from the 2nd century BCE, though the text did not reach its present form until the 4th century CE. Tellingly, it contains 2 separate stories of the renunciation. In the first, the Buddha describes the pleasures of his youth, including, quote, "I was most delicately brought up, O monks, and while I was being thus delicately brought up, my Shakyan father provided me with the means of enjoying the 5 varieties of sensual pleasures, namely dance, song, music, orchestra, and women, that I might divert, enjoy, and amuse myself." There is no mention of chariot rides outside the city. The prince simply concludes one day that life in the home is too full of hindrances, while the homeless life is blameless and pure. Thus, quote, "Against the wishes of my sobbing and weeping parents, I left my sumptuous home and the universal kingship that was in my hands," end quote. Yet in the same text, just 2 chapters later, the story of the renunciation is told again, and in much greater detail, this time including the familiar elements of the chariot rides and the failed seduction in the harem. A very similar version occurs in the famous Pali biography, the Nidana Katha, dated from the 5th century. It's likely some rendition of this text that the Portuguese would have heard in Ceylon. In a lecture entitled "On the Migration of Fables," delivered at the Royal Institution in London on June 3, 1870, Max Muller, the most famous scholar of Asian religions of the 19th century, declared, quote, "St. Josaphat is the Buddha of the Buddhist canon. It follows that the Buddha has become a saint in the Roman Church. The founder of religion, which, whatever we may think of its dogma, is, in the purity of its morals, nearer to Christianity than any other religion, and it has received the highest honors that the Christian church can bestow. No one in the Greek or in the Roman church need be ashamed of having paid to Buddha's memory the honor that was intended for St. Josaphat, the prince, the hermit, the saint. But perhaps in the end, it isn't really about Buddhism and Christianity, about this Buddha or that saint. Regarding the story of the encounters beyond the palace walls, Jorge Luis Borges wrote, quote, "The legend that in the West led to the Buddha's canonization in Rome has one defect. The encounters it postulates are powerful but unbelievable." Yet, if the story was neither originally Buddhist nor originally Christian, if it was just a circulating story, a story that only later came to be invested with belief, then perhaps it was never meant to be believed. Thank you.
Drowsy.
Let me begin with words that we've all heard before on occasions like this, simply because sometimes old words do say things best. Donald Lopez has honored us this afternoon with this lecture, with its easy learning, its grace, and its elegance. We can look forward to the next two lectures of this year's Reischauer lectures, anticipating more of the pleasures of scholarship that he has shared with us today. Those who know Donald Lopez as a scholar know that the learning, grace, and elegance so evident in the talk we just heard is quite typical of his scholarly work generally. This is not the first time that Donald Lopez has turned to Borges to provide commentary on an academic problem in Buddhist studies. Nor is Lopez alone in a hermeneutical fascination with Borges in Asian studies, as is clear from the impact of Foucault's opening to the order of things with its discussion of Borges' story about a Chinese encyclopedia. More old words need to be said. It goes without saying that I'm honored to respond to Donald Lopez's lecture. I know that I could spend all of the time available for this response just praising in detail his scholarship. But out of respect for him, and because he is a friend, I will not risk turning him into a sinner by giving him the chance to actually enjoy such praise too much. I did wonder if such qualms on my part might be uncalled for, since, as we all could tell from his use of honorifics for Thomas Aquinas, Saint Thomas Aquinas, Lopez is clearly quite steeped now in things Christian. He knows that this is Holy Week, and that he will be absolved by week's end of even a deadly sin like enjoying praise. But still. So let us instead remind ourselves that Lopez has placed all of us under the sign of Marco Polo, with the shared epigraph from Marco Polo about the Buddha as the first in whose name idols were made. We should allow ourselves to wonder just what kind of sign Marco Polo and this epigraph might be for us in Buddhist studies and in Asian studies. Indeed, not knowing the overall conclusions of these three lectures, we might even begin to fear that this epigraph is like the dog star, under the sign of which, according to the old superstition, certain ailments of the spirit and of the body are particularly likely to beset us. Let us also remember that Lopez introduced this epigraph by saying that, quote, it comes from Marco Polo himself, who's seated in the Pleasure Dome in Xanadu, which we're also in a version of the Pleasure Dome in Xanadu, who's seated in the Pleasure Dome in Xanadu, described invisible cities to the Kublai Khan. An analogy to this, it seems apt to say that what Lopez did in the lecture we have just heard is describe invisible pasts to us. Their invisibility due to different reasons, whether the oblivion suffered by Bernouf or the different forgetting suffered by Marco Polo's idol. Lopez has restored to us, for example, the invisible past of Sir Henry Yule and honored this remarkable scholar and veteran of the Sikh Wars, even to the extent of relying on notes of Yule's work about Marco Polo's great book, notes which include quite a lot of information about the story of Barlam and Josaphat, the main focus of this afternoon's lecture. Perhaps like Bernouf, Yule has been forgotten because we tend to feel that he was right, but like Bernouf, he is well worth reading today. But of course, Marco Polo's story of the Buddha was not told by Marco Polo to Kublai Khan in the Pleasure Dome in Xanadu, but rather to Rustichello in a prison in Genoa. To say that Marco Polo described invisible cities to Kublai Khan is only accidentally false. For me, introducing Marco Polo as someone who described invisible cities to Kublai Khan is one of the pleasures of Lopez's lecture, perhaps so suitable for this pleasure dome of ours, and key to how I understand it. The invisible cities here is, of course, a lovely allusion to Italo Calvino's even more lovely novel, Invisible Cities, in which Marco Polo does indeed describe the invisible cities of the novel's title. It is by this allusion, as well as by other features of Lopez's scholarship that are like it, that I feel that we are encouraged to receive Lopez's lecture as a writerly text, to use the distinction that Roland Barthes introduced in his little volume, The Pleasures of the Text. That is to say, I want to suggest that Donald Lopez is doing more than conveying information here about a forgotten past in this lecture. But if we are to get even a sense of that more that he is doing, we have to do more than just receive what he says. And what we have to do may even include reenacting some of the hermeneutical actions of Lopez himself. These hermeneutic actions involve not only Marco Polo's book and what we can learn through his descriptions about Buddhist past, which is actually quite a lot, but also reading Marco Polo through the mediations of Calvino and Borges. I might say I'm surprised there's no Melville.
Tomorrow.
Oh, okay. There are rewards for such efforts, for, as Roland Barthes says, writerly texts hold out the possibility of bliss, jouissance in French, and Barthes meant every connotation of the French word, especially by allowing readers to break out of their usual subject positions. For me, the use of Borges and Calvino in this lecture are quite important to what Lopez is doing himself, and also to what he is asking us to do. For me, Borges and Calvino are not expendable ornamentation to some putative real scholarly substance. Having Calvino and Borges be part of the way that we constitute our hermeneutical engagement with the past somehow seems crucial to the possibility that we actually can break out of our usual scholarly subject positions. When we break out of those subject positions with the help of Calvino and Borges, not only do we have a chance to see ourselves differently as scholars, but we also give ourselves the possibility of realizing different tomorrows for ourselves as students of Buddhism. Those 250, actually the text he said 200 names since he sent the text, and now he's found another 50 names. Those 250 different names for this idol that Lopez says he has found in early Mana sources, names like Shaka, Chikya, Zomanokodum, Budu, Poti, Gudam, Daibot, and Photo, may be less the detritus of past best forgotten, and more signposts pointing the way towards a different tomorrow for us all. Calvino and Borges may be the way we see the signpost in what we thought was detritus. But perhaps, like the great Khan did to Marco Polo, I can address Donald Lopez without, however, putting my knee on his chest and seizing him by his invisible beard, as the Khan did to Marco Polo, and say, "This is what I want to hear from you. Confess what you're smuggling. Moods, states of grace, elegies." There is a beautiful scene in Invisible Cities, Calvino's Invisible Cities, in which Kublai Khan says to Marco Polo, after the latter has said that he has told about all the cities that he knows, Kublai Khan says, "There is still one of which you never speak." Marco Polo bowed his head. "Venice," the Khan said. Marco smiled. "What else do you believe I have been talking to you about?" The emperor did not turn a hair. "And yet I have never heard you mention that name." And Polo said, "Every time I describe a city, I am saying something about Venice. When I ask you about other cities, I want to hear about them. And about Venice, when I ask you about Venice." Marco Polo, to distinguish the other city's qualities, I must speak of a first city that remains implicit. For me, it is Venice. Perhaps in a similar way, when Lopez describes to us a number of invisible paths in this Reischauer lectures, every time that he describes one of those paths, Lopez is also saying something about another time, one that is first, but always implicit, one whose name is never mentioned, namely our scholarly present. So one of the biggest tasks for us to understand Lopez in these lectures is to be clear about how he sees the time in which he must always speak first, our present. Only then will we even begin to appreciate what Lopez means when he says, sometimes it is the task of the scholar to dig through the refuse, and why such garbage picking is a task that must be done now. In contrast to our ordinary lives, in which we are routinely aware that we know more than we can say, it does seem that in our scholarly present, rather ironically and also sadly, we often know less than we say. We certainly need better tomorrows. The focus of Lopez's lecture this afternoon, the story of Barlam and Josaphat, can hardly be said to be invisible, but its use in modern scholarship is as fantastic as any of the invisible cities in Calvino's novel. Down on Pussy 3 of the library, actually on a floor below the ground, entered through a tunnel, as if it were part of the invisible city of Argia, whose residents say it's down below there. There's a whole shelf of books about the story of Barlam and Josaphat in Widener's own number system. A whole shelf of these books about Barlam and Josaphat in its various versions, including Ethiopic, which you did not mention. But attention to the derivatives of the story can be found elsewhere in Widener in great works of modern scholarship like Johann Huizinger's The Autumn of the Middle Ages. Huizinger's comment that there is an astonishing similarity between ancient India, that is the Buddhist, and the medieval Christian expressions of his sentiment about the fear of life seems to contrast quite starkly with Lopez's aside that the Buddhist versions and the Christian versions of the story, quote, provide an occasion to reflect on some of the fundamental differences between Buddhism and Christianity. Those of us at Harvard, or at least those of us of a certain age, remember that the story of Barlam and Josaphat set the stage for Wilfred Cantwell Smith towards a world theology, in which he argued, long before our contemporary vogue for connected histories, for the necessity of taking seriously a history of religion in the singular. Here is how he sets his stage. In the later chapters of this study, I shall endeavor to speak theologically about the unity, the interrelation that I discern in the religious history of our race. Here, on the other hand, I begin more concretely, and perhaps more incontrovertibly, with an attempt to exhibit that unity itself, hoping to illustrate it in such a way that my readers too will see, and even feel, at least its historical dimension. Barlam and Josaphat, the story of Barlam and Josaphat, is the way that he wanted us to feel this unity. Note how Wilfred Smith speaks of an illustration that will make his readers see and even feel something. And this is what he uses the Barlam and Josaphat for. In some ways, the Barlam and Josaphat story is also an illustration for Donald Lopez. Its importance is in what it helps us to see rather than what it is. Another novelist can illustrate what I have in mind here. José Saramago, the great Portuguese novelist, includes the following statement in The Elephant's Journey, an account of a gift of an elephant in 1541 by Bhuvaneka Bahu VII, the king of Kotte in Sri Lanka, to the king of Portugal. Clearly a story about the same medieval and early modern world that Lopez is describing for us. At one point in the story, Saramago makes the character exit off stage by saying, he suddenly disappeared from view. He went pluff and vanished. Onomatopoeia can be so very handy. Imagine if we had to provide a detailed description of someone disappearing. It would have taken us at least 10 pages. It strikes me that when scholars take up the Barlam and Josaphat story, from Max Mueller and T.W. Rhys-Davids to Wilfred Cantwell Smith and Donald Lopez, they seem to use the story like Saramago's pluff, telling about the spread of one story to help us see what would otherwise fill libraries if we were to try to provide a detailed description. The story does its work well. Pluff. Let's stay with Saramago, however, and ask what disappears when we use the story of Barlam and Josaphat in the way that Lopez has, as valuable as it may be for what it helps us to see. I think a lot does disappear, a lot that is important. One important thing that disappears is Islam. For key to the spread of Barlam and Josaphat, of the Barlam and Josaphat story westward, is its transmission by Muslims. Barlam and Josaphat is not only a story of Buddhism and Christianity. Much could be made of this, but all I can say here is that Barlam and Josaphat reminds us that from a certain point, the history of Islam in Asia and the history of Buddhism become more than connected. They become intertwined. Sorting out how they were intertwined will involve examining stories as well as much else. Now that Donald Lopez has reminded us that the Buddha became a Christian, we might also remember that the fifth Dalai Lama, the Great Fifth, is reputed to have been converted to Islam by Khayyar al-Din. It is, of course, the same Dalai Lama who gave permission for the first Muslim communities to be established in Lhasa in the 17th century. And according to Buddhists in Sri Lanka, the footprint of the Buddha on Adam's Peak that Marco Polo told us about has its counterpart under the Kaaba in Mecca. We might also wonder whether the interest in the story of Barlam and Josaphat on the part of Muslims was part of the ethnographic interest found across the medieval Islamic world, and of a piece with the life of the Buddha in 20 chapters that is found in Rashiduddin's encyclopedia, which is actually quite accurate in terms of what it tells us about Tibetan versions of the life of the Buddha. Another important thing that disappears is how the story, or at least parts of the story, spread eastward. We are here this afternoon, after all, at the Reischauer lectures. In this lecture this afternoon, Lopez has emphasized the story of the four sites in the Barlam and Josaphat story and in the biography of the Buddha, considering the connections between the two. Another story in the collection, Barlam and Josaphat, that's circulated in Europe, is a bit of spiritual engineering, a story told by Barlam to prompt a life change, a conversion in Josaphat, the sermons that Donald Lopez was referring to. It is this story that is highlighted by Wilfred Cantwell Smith in his book. He says, in this tale, the human condition is portrayed as that of a man who, fleeing from a furious beast, falls into a well and is held from dropping into the jaws of a devouring dragon below by clinging to a bush that will, he sees, presently inevitably give way, since it is being nibbled at by two mice, one white and one black, that go round and round, slowly but relentlessly gnawing at its roots. The two mice are day and night. This story finds its way across Asia and is found in various Chinese and Japanese collections, including the 13th century Japanese Shashakishu, Sand and Pebbles, with the furious beast variously a tiger, elephant, or rhinoceros. The man running, falling into a well or over a cliff, the bush that he's clinging to, dripping honey, or having a strawberry fruit next to it, the man clinging to the bush and tasting the honey or the strawberry and savoring it, which is taken to indicate either his greed, his desire rooted in ignorance, or his ability to live in the moment. That story is well known to American Buddhists, as it is found in Paul Repp's collection, Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, in which the furious beast is a tiger. If we attend to the reception of this story across Asia, going eastward, what we would see would be an internal diversity to the Buddhist world and its interpretations of these stories that is as stark in its differences as the difference in Christian and Buddhist interpretations of the four sites that Lopez speculated about. This story was also received in Europe, of course, as part of the Barlam and Josaphat collection. It was this story of the man hanging in the well that prompted Tolstoy's conversion. As you remember, Tolstoy had come to find his life hauntingly vacuous, meaningless despite his position, wealth, and fame. His readiness to turn his back on his worldly goods and to start afresh by going forth into the world in ascetic piety was given form by this particular fable and triggered as he accepted it for himself. That's Wilfred Smith speaking. Tolstoy wrote about reading this story and what it did to him in his Confessions. And he said, "This is no fable. It is a real, unanswerable truth." A statement that seems to be in the starkest contrast to Borges' observation with which Lopez ended his lecture. The legend that in the West led to the Buddha's canonization in Rome has one defect. The encounters it postulates are powerful, but unbelievable. Real, unanswerable truth. Powerful, but unbelievable. One legend. This is the hermeneutic moment that Donald Lopez has brought us to today, with Tolstoy and Borges like the black and white mice gnawing at the base of a bush to which we cling. We find ourselves in this interpretive moment because, to let Borges have the last word, reality may be too complex for oral transmission. Legend recreates it in a manner which is only accidentally false. So we end by asking how what is only accidentally false should be part of the realities engaged by Buddhist studies. Perhaps the fact that the Buddha is an idol is only accidentally false, and learning the significance of that is a challenge for all of us who study Buddhism.